the Security Effectiveness Challenge. I put this deck together kind of give you perspective, right? Things that you might want to think about when you're going out and building a security solution. So let's get started here. Now, this is not going to be technical. I'm not, showing a configuration. Again, I'm just trying to empower individuals, whether you're seasoned or new to the game, just some of the things that you might want to consider. And obviously, this isn't going to be comprehensive and cover everything, but it just gives you an idea of some of the things that you might want to ask yourself. So in the day, many people start, especially in sales, right, and remote workers, but regardless, many people take their work outside of the organization. I'm just establishing how a compromise may happen, and we all know that there's many different ways for this to take place. But I go in, I get my, my coffee, I'm very happy, right? I connect to the internet that's offering in that location. Fantastic. And I start surfing the internet, and I might be doing a little bit of work as well, right? As I'm going through the day, I may come across a news site, and any site for that matter, and there could be something on that site that compromises my asset. When that happens, the asset's compromised. Now, you might have technologies to mitigate that risk. I'm really not trying to establish that here. What I'm trying to establish here is that this is outside of what we traditionally do from a security perspective, right? And this is how easy it is for someone to compromise the environment. So now I come in later on that day, maybe later on in that week, and I come in and I plug into my network, right? And in many cases, I plug in without any restrictions. There's no validation, I just plug in. Now, there are environments today that will ask for a lot more than just plugging in a cable, right? But let's assume that I plug in and I get on the network, and even if there was some authorization and authentication that took place, a lot of times it may not realize the disposition of my asset, meaning whether it's been compromised or clean. Well, now I'm on the network and I may be moving laterally, right? And I start compromising other assets. All these assets may have access to the data center, and I continue to compromise there. All during that time, we've bypassed that perimeter that we've built, right? That fortified front door that we've, been watching day in and day out, yet it didn't do anything here to help us, right? And so the connections go out, probably a controlled port, whether that's a web port, and may connect directly to the adversary from the inside out. And they have complete access to the environment, right? So pretty easy stuff. But as I go around and I meet many customers, I'm still hearing from time to time that security is not front and center in the organization. And I really struggle with that. Because there's lots of ways to very quickly start that conversation, and just leverage the media, right? It's everywhere. We see it day in and day out, and there's a couple that have been compromised in the last year, right? And use that to start the dialogue, right? Talk about these breaches that have taken place. If that's not an avenue for you to use, then maybe get folks on to shows like Mr. Robot, right? Get them watching it. Get them speaking the same language, right? That's going to help. But when we talk media coverage, what are some of the things that we can consider, right? So the one thing I always talk about is some of the biggest companies have been compromised. I'm talking the best, right? They've been compromised, and they have dedicated security teams. They might have best-of-breed security technologies, and they have a lot of product in the environment focused on security, yet they've been compromised, right? And my question to you, as you're building this out, how do you think you stand against the attackers, right? One might be, well, we're not a target or whatever, and I'll challenge that in, in a moment. But at the end of the day, you have to think, what are you doing to reduce that risk? Like, are you doing anything different than these folks? And in many cases, you don't even have the same level of bench that these larger organizations have. And what I mean by that is the skill sets focused on a specific product or technology or area like security, and that's all they do. A lot of times we're stretching between the network and the security team, right? That's one person, or systems and security, that's one person, and they're wearing multiple hats. So it's very hard to be able to be very effective, right? And there's a couple ways that we think you can solve that, but let's continue. Do you believe your organization's a target? And now I get this still time and again, right? Like people say, well, wait a minute, I'm a small insurance company. Who's really do I really need these security technologies? And the short answer is yes, you absolutely do. And there's a couple reasons why. First and foremost is the adversary knows that you do not have skill sets, right? They know that you don't have the technology. They know that you don't have the people. So you are certainly a target. But not only that, you have relationships with other organizations. And maybe you have a relationship with a very large insurance organization. It might be easier for me to compromise your environment, learn about your environment, learn about the people, and use that to attack that larger organization. But while I'm there, I'm going to steal everything. And the other thing to consider too is security is actually a business enabler, right? You can actually use security as a catalyst to why other businesses should be doing businesses with you, or should do business, with you, right? And one of that is, or one thing to consider here is that if you have a very strong security posture, you've got technologies in place, you speak the lingo or the language. When you're building a partnership, they're going to see that you do widget A, another organization does widget B, and maybe you're very similar. There's some, benefits to each product on either side, but maybe the security footprint of one organization is enough to differentiate, right? People want to do business with companies that haven't been breached, right? I think we all agree with that. Has this become a boardroom discussion or senior leadership discussion, right? And if it's not, again, use these examples to get the dialogue going. But it certainly should be something that's talked about. And again, if you transition this to be more around a business enabler discussion as opposed to security lock the doors, make it difficult for users, you might see greater success there. And then ultimately, will your company survive if a security breach did take place? And the reason why I bring this up is because many don't, right? And I think most people probably believe that. But when you look at some of the numbers, this is what's interesting, right? Getting struck by lightning is 1 in 960,000, right? Dating a millionaire is 1 in 220. So some of us have some hope there. And then experiencing a data breach is 1 in 4. 1 in 4, right? So if you haven't been breached, you most likely just don't know that you've been breached, or they're in there right now, right? So another area to consider is time to detection. How long does it take before you know the adversary is in your environment? And the way I look at this is, imagine me, I broke into your house. Now, I'm not going to do that, but if I was to break into your house and get into your house, I sit on your couch and I watch the behaviors, of everybody that's in the home. I know what time people get up. I know when they go to work. I know what they eat for lunch. And I observe, right? And I watch and I learn, right? And during that time, nobody in that house knows I'm there, right? And I know that sounds creepy, but that's essentially what's happening, right? In your network, the adversary's there and they're learning and they're watching and they're taking, right? They're going into the fridge and they're taking grapes and you don't know there's lots of grapes there, so you didn't know anything was missing. So that's the challenge. So the industry average is around 100 days. And at Cisco, we're roughly around 3.5 hours. And that's got to do with a lot of things, right? And partly to do with the telemetry that we've got coming in. We're very good at seeing the threat landscape from all different angles, whether that be DNS, IPS, endpoint, open source feeds, etc., right? We've got a good team of folks that look out for this stuff, and that's called Talos. But we're roughly around 3.5 hours. So it's a significant difference than the industry average. And then it starts to the things that help with the response, right? Everybody's trying to get that 100% prevention. Every vendor and manufacturer is trying to achieve that goal. And all of us are very high, right? We're at the 99, well, not all of us, but most of us are around 99%, right? Depending point something, right? But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because you'll never be remembered for all the threats that you've been batting out of the air, right? You're only going to be remembered for the threat that got in. And then how did you handle that threat? So we've done a lot of work around making sure that if you did get compromised, although we're trying to stop that 100%, right? We're trying to stop everything. But if you do you have the capabilities to really scope, contain, and remediate that threat? So does the organization understand that hackers could be in your environment for up to 100 days, right? Before you even know, right? And there's things that you can do to help detect that. And we'll talk about that in a second. Do you know what is connected and when? And do you have control over those assets? So that example at the coffee shop, when I plugged into the network and I got compromised and I come back into the environment and plug in, would you know that that asset was plugged in? And is that your corporate asset? Is it a printer? Is it a smart TV? What is it, right? And should it be on the network? And can I control that? This one's a big one, right? Do you know what normal looks like? If your security technologies fail, no matter what vendor you go with, would you know? And the short answer is no. You're going to wait for your security technologies, for the most part, to catch up to tell you that something was in there. But if you baseline your environment and truly understand what normal looks like, then when something bad happens, like an SMB 445 probe starts happening across from one asset to many assets within the layer 2 network, right? So that broadcast domain, we now have the ability to do something with that, right? How do you reduce time to detection to ensure it meets business expectations? Well, most people don't know what time to detection is for their organization, right? So you might want to look at how you might be able to capture that metric, right? When a threat might have been first seen in your environment, and then when your technologies started mitigating against that risk. Are you able to enforce dynamic control based on assets' current disposition? Again, I go back to that coffee shop example, and if I was to plug into your network and I'm compromised, or shortly after for that matter compromised, can your network adapt to that and change the control put on that asset? So can I say that that asset has access to these resources, but now since I've recognized that it's been compromised, I now want to move it and automate that response to move it into a quarantine VLAN and do additional inspection and control the asset a little more. Or maybe shut the port down, right? But at the end of the day, can you do that, right? At 2 a.m, and can it be automated? Do you even know when what your current time to detection is? And I mentioned that earlier, right? It's maybe start looking at that as a metric, right? Try to really understand when are your security technologies catching it versus when it's in your organization. So the perimeter, right? The perimeter is starting to dissolve. Gartner says by 2018, 25% of corporate data traffic will bypass the perimeter security. And not only that, the mobile workforce, you have people that are in and out, but we've done a good job of making that perimeter pretty scary looking, right? You've got zombies, you've got bows and arrows, you've got maybe alligator moats, right? We've got all the technology that's there, yet, we're still getting compromised. But the adversary also knows how to get around this, right? And that's why they have been successful. So what are some of the things that we can talk about just based on the perimeter starting to dissolve, right? It's still going to exist. It's not going to go away. But have you considered the impact to your security posture? What does it mean when an asset goes off-prem and comes back in? I mean, I've spent thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars fortifying that perimeter. And yet I let an asset, a laptop, go home with just AV, right? Antivirus, no advanced malware, no DNS layer protection, nothing, right? Just go, and then when you come back in, we'll deal with it then, right? But by that time, it's too late because it's going out port 80. Port 80 is allowed, and the adversary may have access to the environment. How are you protecting assets off premise? So again, as they're in and out, whether you're moving into the cloud, the data's in the cloud, and I'll talk about that in a second. How are you protecting that asset, right? We already know that AV's not good enough. So what other technologies are you using? Is it seamless? Are you forcing VPN or users to VPN back in? And there's some headaches that come with that. And does that agent include things like DNS layer protection or content filtering, right? Or advanced malware inspection, right? What if a USB gets plugged in? So the doors continue to open, which invites the adversary, or makes the layer obviously a lot more penetratable. But what are you doing to add layers of automation to protect against this threat, right? Are you able to dynamically understand that change within the environment, share that intelligence with other systems, and be able to then mitigate that risk? Do you know what your users are doing in the cloud? And, I get this a lot, and they say, yeah, I've got a next-gen firewall, and, we're blocking cloud-based applications and such. And that's great, right? And that's something that you probably want to do. But what about those assets that are leaving the organization, right? Do you have that same control in place? In most cases, they don't, right? And we know how clever business users are, right? The business wants to move forward, and sometimes they look at IT as a bottleneck, right? It's going to take forever to get a service lit up. And we've always got the one person in that organization, in that department, that knows a little bit about systems and says, hey guys, don't worry about it. Let's throw it up in the cloud, and that way we can use it when we get home. Oh, they blocked it at NGFW? No worries. Let's just connect to our phone and send the data up that way, right? They're always going to try to find a way to bypass it, especially if they can access it very easily from the assets that they have that come in and out of the organization, like a laptop. How are you adding security services that are agile? So this has always been a challenge where security is always brought in late to the game. So company wants to build a new service. They, buy the network, they buy the storage, they buy the compute, they build out the architecture, they start deploying, it goes live, and then they pull security in, goes, oh yeah, you guys got to secure this. And security's like, well, wait a minute, I need this, no, there's no budget. So we're challenged with always trying to figure out a way to make it work as best we can with what we have. It would be nice if we had a bucket of technologies that we can just insert as we need them, right? The industrial Internet of Things, or just Internet of Things in general, right? And whether that's a smart TV that's in an organization, a thermostat, and this could be at home as well, right? These are things that home users now really got to start thinking about. And it could be anything like manufacturing systems. It could be a CTR scanner in a hospital. But all of these devices are connecting to our environment, and you can install an agent. So there's a lot of challenges that come with that, right? So do you think your devices could be exploited and used to deny services to business partners? Now, what if they were able to come in and jump into some of these devices where you can install an agent? There's very little footprint that you can do from a security perspective, because if you do install something, the manufacturer voids warranty, right, at that point in time. So you're really dependent on those perimeter type technologies. And we saw that with the IoT device last year, right? That took down a DNS provider, right, with a DDoS capability. So these are things that you wouldn't even know are taking place. And if a DDoS attempt came from your IoT devices in your organization, would you even know it right away, right? Would you be able to see that network start to become saturated? And in most cases, you won't. Since you can't install agents because you avoid the warranty a lot of times, and you quite simply can't install an agent on a light bulb, right? What about DNS, right? As security practitioners, we haven't really looked at DNS as a possible mechanism to help further secure the environment, right? We're always looking further down in the connection stream. What about if we did it earlier on at the DNS layer, right? To me, the way we've done it is everybody's at the perimeter, like the adversary's at your door, like they're at your office knocking at it. They know you're there. They're working away. DNS to me is the city limits, right? Where the adversary doesn't even know you exist yet, right? You're blocking further away from the asset as possible. Something to think about, right? Are the operational and information technology groups working together, right, to solve that security challenges? So both groups, IT and OT, have value, right? They've got to start coming together. And yes, I know some people look at OT, they have engineering. Engineering to them means something different than in IT, right? They have the ring, the power of Grayskull, right? But at the end of the day, OT really understands that operational environment, and IT understands security. They've been doing it a long time, right? And they understand about networks and packets, and they've been focused on it. If we can bring those teams together, I think we'd have greater success in that environment. How do you stop lateral movement if a device gets compromised? So I said this earlier, if a device gets compromised, whether that's a printer, whether that's a critical asset or an asset that might be less critical but not a traditional IT device like a phone or printer or a laptop, desktop, or whatever, right? It's more like machine. And how are you able to stop that east-west lateral movement, or even movement within that same VLAN, right? So I'm in the same VLAN. How do I stop that propagation? So you want to have dynamic controls. You want to do things at the access layer or close to the asset as possible to mitigate that risk. And again, sometimes you have to understand the environment to understand that you've been compromised. Not your security technologies are not always going to determine that. And how are you protecting IoT devices today? So what are you doing? Is it really the only thing that you've got in place is the perimeter? And do you even know if someone's bringing in a smart TV and installing the applications on the smart TV like Netflix, etc., right? And what does that mean to your security posture overall? Can you control when a device is added to your production floor or corporate network? So, for example, can I walk into a field location and get into a closet and plug in and get an IP address, right? Can I do that? Can I walk into a corporate building and plug in my laptop running Kali and get access to the environment, right? Do you have the ability to control this and dynamically? So what I mean by that is if someone moves in a printer and plugs into the network and they want to move it somewhere else, the user should have the freedom and flexibility to do that. And when they plug it in, the port should dynamically understand that that's a printer and then put the right controls on it. Likewise, if someone unplugs it and plugs in a laptop, it should dynamically understand that that's a laptop from a corporate user with the right security posture and is allowed access to the environment with these levels of controls in place. Do you know at any given point in time which devices are connected? And now this one's interesting because in most environments they don't know. In the data center, in mid-sized data centers, most people will have a very good idea of what's in there. Large size, it becomes there's more groups involved and more teams. But typically they do have a good idea of what's in the environment. Where they don't is on the campus network or VPN, right? If you VPN in, can you dynamically truly understand what that user's doing, and can you baseline it so if someone steals that credential, gets into the environment and starts poking around, would that trigger an alert? Would you even know, right? Or would you just think Johnny connected like he does all the time and just happens to be moving around, which you didn't see anyway, right? The cloud. So the cloud's interesting, right? So if you look at the applications in the cloud itself, in 2014, I think we've got a number around 5,500. In 2017, we're at 270,000 plus, right? So there's no shortage of cloud-based applications. We're going to continue to push forward with that, but it obviously brings in many challenges. By 2020, 92% of global data centers traffic will come from the cloud itself, right? So that introduces all kinds of talking points, right? And again, the idea around this is kind of think of this holistically and then use these talking points to to start the dialogue, right? If security is not a priority, maybe this will help get it a priority. If it's a priority, let's continue that movement, right? And ensuring that there is continued dialogue. But how do you protect cloud-borne data? So data that's not even in your environment. So things like personal identifiable information, right? Can you control that when it's in the cloud? Who it's being shared with? How do you mitigate threat of malware born in the cloud, right? We've seen this recently where there was a compromise of an application that was put out there to compromise individuals when they connect. There's also another thing that you have to think about is OAuth. So OAuth is it allows you to connect a device. And then, connect the device, you download the application, and then when you download the application, it'll ask you to authenticate. And Pokemon's a perfect example of this, right? So I think the telephone took, I think it was 75 years or something like that to get 100 million subscribers. Like, it was a long time for the telephone to get to 100 million. And Facebook did it in record time to get 100 million users. And then something like Pokemon Go, within 1 month, hit 100 million subscribers. Like, it's incredible the amount of growth there. But everybody was out there downloading it, gets it installed. And say you have Gmail, right? You have Gmail for a corporate email offering, and so you download the Pokemon application, you're really excited, and then it asks you to authenticate, and you're like, oh man, okay, I can authenticate with Gmail. Oh wait, I'm using my corporate Gmail. Just a second, let me plug that in, and I plug in my corporate Gmail account, and then the next thing comes up. It asks you, can I have access to read, write, send, email, files, location, etc. And you say, I don't care what you want. I want access to Pokemon Go. I got to catch Pokemons, right? And that's not me, but obviously somebody listening to this is definitely playing it. But at the end of the day, what you've essentially done is given that Pokemon application the ability to send email on your behalf, read your email, and that happens now to be corporate email. You wouldn't even have visibility into that, right? So things like that, right? Not even thinking about it. What does that mean? Well, that application could, in this case, Pokemon's not malicious, but if it was malicious, and we've seen that with Google Docs, right? That last year, I believe it was Google Docs, where someone created a fake application. But the idea now is I can send and pretend I'm you, right? And then people trust that. The other thing too is, if I was to authenticate into Gmail and then 3 hours from now I authenticate into Salesforce in Africa, and I originally connected from Canada to Gmail, the distance to travel, it would be impossible for me to be in two places. Well, your cloud applications aren't able to tell you that these two applications were logged in with the same credential, right, from different places in the world, meaning it would be impossible, right? So you want some insight into that to be able to say, wait a minute, I've got two cloud applications. We've got users logging into multiple different applications from multiple different locations. We have a compromise here. Do you know who is sharing what in the cloud and with who? So things like, you put a file up in a file storage in the cloud, and then I decide to share that with friends or competitors for that matter. Would you even know, right? So, and then do you know that the content in there should be in the cloud, right? Is there credit card information in that data when it gets to the cloud? And we got to think about it beyond just the internal network, right? So proxy-based could be an element to secure that. The challenge with that is, what about off-prem, right? Is it API native? How do I mitigate that risk? Are business units bypassing IT and going to the cloud without IT's knowledge? So we see this all the time, right? I can go back 10 years ago where we saw file servers stood up in certain business units because they didn't want to be bothered by the controls put in place by IT. And that exists today. The difference is that people have went to the cloud, right? And they put that data out there, and business users typically don't know what data should or shouldn't be there for the most part, unless you've got, data classification fully baked in the organization, right? But as we get into smaller organizations, they're struggling just to secure the environment, never mind classifying data. Do you have user behavioral and entity analytics? And this is what I was saying earlier about the two countries, right? I'm logged into two countries. Or two applications from two different countries. Would you even know about that, right? Ransomware. So I included this because it's everywhere. If anything, you should be able to start dialogue with just this topic alone. So the one big thing is, would you pay if you were compromised? The one thing that you want to think about is everyone will say no, and I think that's the general consensus. We don't want to empower the bad guys. But at the end of the day, make sure that you go through a variety of use cases so you truly understand whether or not you would be in a position to have to pay, right? So if I shut down a manufacturing line, then I might be more willing to pay because I'm losing millions maybe of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? But there's never a guarantee that you'll get the data back, although the bad folks want you to get that because it is a business that they are running. So they want you to get the data back. But also you might want to go to a third party and have them do the negotiation, right? So you don't want to call up and say, hey, yeah, I'm losing $100 million a day. Like, I need this up now, because the moment you do that, the adversary says, oh, wait a minute, the price just went up, right? So you want to look as small as possible. But again, you got to remember all these defensive techniques that we put in place, the adversary's reading the same stuff we're reading. So we've got to take note of that. Do you know email is the main attack vector for malware? So, that hasn't changed. And if you're using built-in security capabilities in email, you should really consider a pure play email security technology, right? That focuses on email security. And there's a huge difference. I do tests all over the country, and I can tell you there's a big difference. Did you know malware uses DNS when communicating? So have you considered that as a protection layer, right? And this is interesting. 91% of C2s are blocked at the DNS layer. And again, this is earlier on, right? This is farthest away from the adversary as possible, right? I haven't even attempted the connection to them. I've done it at DNS. So there's certainly an opportunity there. Are you getting discounts based on security technologies you have in place when buying cyber insurance? So, if you go home and you buy a home alarm system and you put it in, your insurance company says, well, okay, you got a home alarm system, so, we'll give you a discount. Well, that should be the same in the corporate side, right? If you go out and buy certain security technologies, you should get a reduction in costs when it comes to cyber insurance. And Cisco and Apple, I know, are working towards that. I'm really not sure where that is currently today, but that's something that you want to keep an eye out for, right? Because there's value there, right? Now, the attackers, like I said, are watching as well and learning. So they're trying to make it harder and harder for you to recover. So they're either embedding malware into backups, so when you do the restoration, they continue to be prevalent in the environment, or they might start releasing data. So again, just be ready, right? What you might think of just having 30 days of backups is enough. You might come to find that all you're doing is restoring the bad, right? And you're just going through this repeated cycle over and over and over again, right? Can you detect encrypted malware present in the network even if security technologies fail to detect? Now, the reality is this. Every vendor is trying to provide 100% protection. Period. End of story. The reality is that nobody can achieve that today. So are you able to leverage other technologies or the technologies that you purchase today in regards to security or network, for example, or system? Are you able to leverage capabilities within that platform to help you, right? And encrypted malware is something that you can actually analyze and understand without having to actually decrypt that payload. So you can actually take NetFlow data and certain headers from that and get very high levels of efficacy in determining whether or not you have malware running in the network. So we know malware obviously understands this, right? The adversary understands this, I should say, and malware now being produced obviously includes some type of encryption. What about USBs? Now, this is interesting because this has always been a problem. I've seen things like silicone filled into the USB slots. I've seen GPOs being used to control access to it. You could do things like when an asset connects, you could have it, if you had an agent, for example, you might be able to do things like USB and see if it's enabled and disable it before you even let it on the network. But Hack5 did this, and you can't quote me on the numbers, although I am stating what I got off the internet. But they went out and they configured a bunch of USB keys that did nothing malicious, but did just tracked some things. They wanted to see if they distributed 100 USB keys or 100 duckies in this case, any technical individual on the security side and don't know about Hack5, go check them out for sure. But they had 162 executions, right? So 100 duckies out there, they had 162 executions. So obviously those duckies were shared and multiple people used them. What they found was there were 62 unique IPs, 5 nations in 65 days. So this all happened within 65 days. Now, people might say, well, people don't plug in USBs. No, they do. People go to conferences and pick up the USB. And I think the bigger the USB, the more attractive it becomes, right? Especially if you're, in IT, right? You walk by, oh man, a 64 gig USB. Oh, I've hit the jackpot, right? Plug it in. Anyways, it's scary stuff, but a reality. Now, this one's interesting here. If I go to you and I say, if I go to a dedicated network individual and I say, how many security technologies, how many networking vendors are in play today? And they would struggle to give me 10 vendors. If I go to a storage individual and I say, hey, Mr. Storage or Mrs. Storage expert, how many storage vendors are out there? And they would come back with a number, but they would struggle to get 10. If I say server, etc., they all have the same problem. At RSA last year, there was hundreds and hundreds, and I've heard numbers of 1,300 to 1,600. I don't know what the actual number is, but there were lots. And this to me is convoluted, right? It is hard to manage. There's all kinds of problems that come with this. And I don't know that it can be sustained, right? I think you're going to have to see some consolidation. We have seen some of that, especially things like CASB. But how can you effectively manage this many vendors, right? I mean, that's tough. And that's just managing the vendors, right? How skilled can your team really be? At the end of the day, the team has to operate these technologies. They got to figure out how to get them to integrate. They're stuck when they upgrade and an API breaks. Who's on the hook? Is it the vendor you upgraded, or is it the other vendor that ties into that vendor, right? It becomes challenging. What are you doing differently when compared to others that failed? Again, we've talked about this earlier. Everybody's trying to cobble this big security fortified environment that has all these different technologies providing insight and controls. But it hasn't worked. I'm not saying that. Just read the paper. How are you managing integration, which helps reduce time to detection, right? So am I able to say, if I saw something on an endpoint, can I right-click it and then say, you know what, I think this is bad. I don't care what threat intelligence tells me. I think it's bad based on the behavior of this file. If I right-click and block it, are you actually now able to have that block automatically block at email as it comes into the environment, or at the next-gen firewall if you have one, right? Are you able to say, bang, wipe this out in every area that I can possibly mitigate this risk? Is fragmentation of product and threat intelligence causing delay in response? Now, I've seen this. This is a real story. We had our technologies. When I say our, in this case, it's Cisco technologies in place, and they were doing a POV. They had another POV technology, another technology in the POV focused on network-based malware protection. And it was us and them. And what they did on the perimeter, they enabled their firewalls to be able to inspect there as well for advanced threats, malware. And then they had an endpoint that had the capability to also do malware. And so they enabled it in all of them. And they called me up and they say, hey, I found something on your box. And but the other guys didn't see it. And honestly, that's not what I'm trying to say here. So I'm not saying, oh, the other guys failed. I'm just saying that could have been the other way. It really doesn't matter. But we happened to catch it. So then they said, well, wait a minute. The next-gen firewall missed it. But our endpoint caught it. So I have 2 products tell me that they caught it, 2 products that say they don't, right? What do I do? And I said, well, that's your future, right? You have competing insight into who believes what in the data. And at one point that made a lot of sense. We used to get all these different security technologies to get different views of the data. And if one failed, maybe we'll catch it further on, right? In this case, the endpoint did catch it, right? So it did get caught maybe at the very last moment, but it did get caught. And we did that because we wanted to be sure if somebody had different views that you had the ability to mitigate the risk somewhere along that chain. But today, that's not the case, right? Like today, for example, there's large organizations, Cisco is one of them, that has went out and bought those disparate technologies that you used to consider best of breed on their own. And they've went and bought them and brought them in, maintained their capabilities, but added integration. So now you get all those same different views, but now you have one security entity like Talos being able to watch them and pull all that information together to say, okay, we saw it in DNS, we see this, we now see this a potential exploit kit going to be leveraged. This could be tied to a file that we saw in an attachment on this email that comes from this individual, and they start building out kind of all the elements involved, and then they look at where can we mitigate that risk, right? Can we mitigate it in DNS? Can we mitigate it on the endpoint? Can we mitigate it in multiple different areas, right? There's an advantage to that. And again, now the intelligence that I receive is the same name, right? There's no confusion. If it's blocked on the endpoint, it's blocked on the next-gen firewall. It's blocked in the email security device. It's blocked in DNS, right? It's all blocked all together. It all looks the same. It's the same language. There's no confusion. That allows me to respond so much faster. I don't have to go back and cross-correlate and second-guess the technologies. Do you see any security automation with your stack? And we talked about that already. How do you sit with security effectiveness when compared to complexity? So as you continue to add security technologies from multiple different vendors, right? We saw that list. Are you getting enough effectiveness? Well, you're not. You're getting some, so you're getting some improvement, but the complexity outweighs that. So what you want to do is increase the effectiveness overall, right? And decrease the complexity. So at Cisco, we've went out, we've listened to our customers, and we went out and we've shored up in areas where we may have been weaker in. Over the last 5 years, we have been building this, but now we've got this security architecture, right? So what we've learned during this journey is customers, especially, I could sell, integration very easily to a network individual. Not all network individuals, don't take offense to this. I was one, right? But it was always compelling to add IPS to a ISR router because I can, right? Not because it was best, because I can turn it on. I don't need anything more. But if you went to dedicated security teams and you said, hey, wait, what do you think of IPS? They would have said things like SourceFire, right? So we've went out, we started building this, but now we've got this architecture so we can automate some of this. They work together, right? You plug in an asset, the disposition changes, it gets punted off the network. We do additional analysis. We know what normal looks like. We can inspect the email as it's coming in. You've got perimeter type security, but when you're off-prem, you're still protected. And if data moves into the cloud, we still have visibility and control there as well. So it's interesting. So Cisco's, one, if not the only one, that can provide that level of integration. And in closing, here's a couple of things to think about. I'm not going to talk about these in detail here, But what is your time to detection, right? How many security products do you own? How complex does it make it? Do you have any security automation? And are you on the hook for that automation? Are you the one that has to figure it out? How are you dealing with shadow IT and cloud security? Not only on-prem, folks, but also off-prem. What happens when the user wants to go directly from the laptop in the cottage to the cloud? How are you mitigating that risk? Do you know what normal looks like on the network? This one is, to me, is one of the biggest, right? Because this is an area that's almost 100% greenfield. People aren't looking here, right? They're so busy trying to fortify that perimeter, right? They're looking at all the traditional security technologies, but they're not looking at other areas that might improve their overall visibility and then ultimately the ability to mitigate risk. Do you know what is connected to your network at any given time? How are you addressing the mobile workforce, right? What would you like additional discounts? So if you buy multiple security, you're going to buy those technologies. I showed you that list, right? And we don't do them. We don't do it all. Cisco doesn't do it all. There's all kinds of other technologies out there, right? There's, you got SIM, you've got all kinds of other pieces that you're still going to require that falls outside of what the Cisco portfolio has. But if a lot of those core elements that you saw on that previous slide, you're going to need. And you can buy them from lots of different vendors. We saw lots of them. The problem is that you're stuck with integration. Are you getting higher levels of efficacy? And do you get any discounts and savings? Is there an operational overhead to that, right? There's a lot of challenges with that approach. And the industry's proven it hasn't been successful. How are you dealing with legislation changes like PIPEDA? So this is more of a Canadian focus. There's some changes that are happening with breach reporting, right? Mandatory. And I don't know all the details of it yet. I think it's in legislation. I don't know that it's been signed in yet. But there will be a mandatory breach reporting. And what is that going to look like, right? Again, you're only going to be remembered for the breaches. You're not going to be remembered, with the superhero effort for everything that you blocked. What are you doing around security intelligence, right? What does that look like? Where are the feeds coming from? You used to go to all these different vendors to get that insight into the threat landscape. Well, now there's organizations that have a strong set of that already, right? From DNS to endpoint to open source technologies, etc. And Cisco is one of those. Do you have advanced malware protection everywhere, right? You can't just look at one area and protect it and think you're good, right? So do you have it in email, web, endpoint? The idea here is that you want to have multiple ways to stop the threat. You don't have to be successful in all of them, just one of them. But if one fails, you want to be able to move down that stack. Are you considering direct-to-internet connections at the branch? I'm seeing this all the time. People want the same level of protection, but they do not want to backhaul the traffic to the head end anymore. It costs too much, and there's challenges with direct-to-internet access. Like, how do I make sure I've got the same level of security? Do I put a next-gen firewall at the remote branch? Do I use DNS as a layered security approach? Do I enhance the endpoint, right? Do you have cybersecurity insurance? Does this make sense? Is this something that we should be pushing for, right? Maybe ask around, right? Talk to the folks at Cisco and say, look, where are you guys at with cybersecurity insurance? Is there something there that you guys are working on in regards to Apple? What does that look like? Are you interested in simplifying the number of vendors? And I think everybody in the industry has already said that, right? It's too complex, and we need to make it a little more simple. And that's it, right? I know it sounds scary, but honestly, if you take a systematic approach to this and really think about how the adversary would compromise your environment and work through that, you'll add the layers. What I would challenge you with is try to do that and get some efficiencies, right? Not only from a dollar perspective, but from an automation perspective. And make sure that you're not on the hook with trying to pull this all together on your own. Anyways, that's it for me today.